Of an estimated 1,500 active volcanoes worldwide, an average of 500 erupt each year. Over the last decade, volcano tourism has boomed with lava chasers, but many more of us have become lava watchers during the pandemic through the eyes of a live cam in Iceland and the unfolding crisis in St. Vincent. Dr. Jonathan Lees is professor and former department chair in the Department of Geological Sciences at UNC Chapel Hill. He's an expert in fault zones, volcano imaging, explosive volcanism, and geothermal imaging. Thanks so much for taking some time for us, Dr. Lees.
My pleasure.
I was taken aback by the number of potentially active volcanoes, with some a lot closer to home than one might think. So there's different kinds of volcanoes. They can all behave very differently. What is it that creates the right conditions for an eruption? And what determines whether it results in a slow ooze, which is how La Soufrière started in St. Vincent, or dramatic explosions like we've seen in Iceland?
So, yeah, first of all, volcanoes are erupting all the time, all around the world. And it has to do with plate tectonics. Plates are moving around, and sometimes when the plates collide, we have a situation where one plate goes under another plate, and that creates a certain kind of volcanism called subduction volcanism. And other times, plates are separating out, and we get volcanism associated with that. And that is in Iceland. An example is in Iceland. And then the third kind of volcanism is the kind that we have in Hawaii, where we have a plume coming up from deep in the mantle up to the surface. And so whether a volcano is extremely explosive or not depends on the gases and the viscosity of the volcano. So as an example, when the lava comes up out of volcanoes in Hawaii, it loses the gases very quickly, and it comes out and it oozes out. On the other hand, where they have very viscous magmas, like in the Cascades or in the Andes, then the gases get trapped and they builds up pressure, and you have these big explosions. So in Iceland, as an example, most of the volcanism there is the kind where the magma is coming up, losing its gases quickly, and the lava oozes out and flows into the ocean. In this case, it doesn't flow into the ocean, it's flowing into a deep valley, but eventually it'll flow into the ocean.
Well, you've likened those little earthquakes that happen around a volcano to a beating heart. You were a lead researcher on an expedition to Peru a few years back and installed devices on a volcano there to transmit information. So tell us, how are volcanoes monitored, and can scientists predict with accuracy the timing of an eruption and the magnitude of that eruption, or is there still much that's unpredictable?
Yeah, so I'm a geophysicist, I'm a seismologist. We typically monitor volcanoes with seismometers, so we're measuring the shaking of the ground. And in the last maybe 25 years or so, we've been measuring also the acoustic waves at a very low frequency. So we have our instruments record the shaking of the ground and the sort of vibrations in the atmosphere. And there are some volcanoes that have explosions, and following the explosions, or even prior to the explosions, there is this sort of vibration that's going on that's continuous, and it sounds like a locomotive going by. And we call that kind of special activity chugging. And the chugging is like the beating of a heart inside of the volcano, and we're monitoring that. We want to know, is there going to be a heart attack or not? And so that's the one thing that I work on personally. The other question you asked, and there are other ways to monitor volcanoes. People monitor the gases. People monitor the chemistry of the lavas that come out. Those are usually separate volcanologists that do different things. Sometimes we all work together, and most of the time we're working independently, and we try to combine our data together. And then the last question you asked is, are we getting any closer to predicting when these things will explode? And that's a very tricky question. It turns out that volcanoes are easier to anticipate what's going to happen than earthquakes. But still, there are a lot of situations where the seismic activity increases and there's no explosion. And there are situations where there's almost no seismic activity and suddenly there's an explosion. So we, in our field, we do not generally say that we can predict the eruptions. some volcanoes, the activity underneath the volcano increases, and then we create like a red zone and we evacuate people and we put alerts out, and in many cases we get an eruption. But it doesn't always work that way, so therefore we have to be very careful about whether we call it prediction or not.
Well, 15,000 people displaced in St. Vincent. I guess another one of the unpredictables is how long will this volcano go on?
Yeah, so in the Caribbean, there's a set of subduction volcanoes. They're explosive. They have varying kinds of activity. I should also state that many volcanoes have a variety of different activities. It's not just one or the other. But we've had numerous cases in the last 100 years of volcanoes erupting in the Caribbean. People live on these little islands. It's a wonderful place to live. It's a good environment, tropical and good agriculture, but those are volcanoes and they are not dormant. They're active. And the problem is that on a human time scale, it seems like a volcano is just sitting there and it's dormant and it's not active. But on a geological time scale, these are very active volcanoes and they will explode. And if it takes 100-year, periodicity of this to erupt, it will happen.
Well, they spew lava, but they also spew steam, ash, toxic gases, as you were saying. It's reported that the plumes from the volcanic eruption on St. Vincent made its way around the globe in 14 days. So what's the impact of volcanic ash and those gases on human health, the environment, and social implications that come with it?
Let me just say one thing. Lava flows, which is what everybody always asks me about, is not the most dangerous part of a volcanic eruption. Lava flow often goes slowly enough that you could walk or run from. But there's another kind of activity when a plume comes out of the volcano during an eruption and then falls down the side of the volcano. Those are very dangerous. They go very quickly and they just burn up everything in their path. And so the people who were killed in the Caribbean in the recent years from volcanic eruptions were killed from these so-called, they call them pyroclastic flows or density flows. Those are very dangerous and people are very worried about that. Now, occasionally you have a big eruption and the plumes go up into the stratosphere and they travel around the globe. And I don't think that the eruptions that we've recently had were so big that they would change the atmosphere significantly. But Mount Pinatubo, 1991, erupted, and it was such a large eruption that it changed the temperature and the global temperature by a degree for a few years. So it can cause climate change.
It's a massive impact when you stop and think about it. And then there's some suggestion that global warming can increase volcanic activity. Is there any indication that volcanic activity is actually on the rise?
I'm very skeptical about that. So far, we've had some recent, what is on the rise is media paying attention to these eruptions. And the other thing is on the rise is humans living closer and closer to volcanoes. So we have potential for disaster is rising. But in terms of the volcanic activity, I'm not aware that there's anything unusual about activity that we've seen in the last year or the last 10 years or whatever. And I'd be very skeptical of anybody who suggested that somehow things are different now.
Well, and Iceland's eruption captured the attention and the eyes of the world with that live cam. It is an unusual area in terms of seismic activity and tectonic shifting. Researchers were able to get quite close, as well as a lot of onlookers. I understand somebody was trying to fry an egg up there. What are researchers in Iceland hoping to learn from this particular volcano?
And one thing I should say is that we have a crew there now. One of our researchers from my group is now installing microphones around the active vents there. So I'd like to put a plug in for him. His name is Oliver Lamb. He was a postdoc in our group, and now he's still a postdoc in our group, but he's moved to Iceland. And he installed some microphones low frequency microphones that were recording. Of course, the Icelandic community and other researchers from around the world have put seismic instrumentation around the active vents. The eruption in Iceland is on the boundary between North America and Eurasia. So those two plates are separating out, and when those two plates separate, there's material that comes up below, and that's what Iceland the faults in Iceland come from this separation of these two plates. Iceland is not a heavily populated island, but but there are people who live not very far in Reykjavik, not very far from where this eruption occurred. And, they're fortunate nobody was hurt that I know of, but it's a good big tourist attraction for the Icelanders. And I'm happy that people get a chance to visit and see this activity. It's pretty spectacular.
It is a fascinating topic, and people truly are amazed by the spectacle. Before we close, are there any volcanoes closer to home that are showing signs of imminent activity? 169 active in the US, 21 in Canada. Any of those showing any signs?
Yeah, let me just clarify. We have quite a few volcanoes in the United States, but most of them are in Alaska along the Aleutian Arc. So the Aleutian Arc is a subduction zone. There are big volcanoes there. They erupt all the time. There's very few people who live there. And so most of the time, these eruptions go unnoticed by media. So that's where most of the volcanoes are. But we have volcanoes in the Cascades that are potentially dangerous. And of course, we have volcanoes in Hawaii. The volcanoes in the Cascades are potentially dangerous. You know, Mount St. Helens erupted in 1979. Caused quite a bit of disruption. It was a relatively small eruption, incidentally, and 60 people were killed during that eruption. I did my PhD research at the University of Washington 4 years after the eruption occurred. And so my early research that I did was about Mount St. Helens and studying that volcano. The other volcanoes in the Cascades are potentially dangerous. Mount Rainier is potentially dangerous. To say that we should be concerned to the point of evacuation or whatever is I think that's a little bit alarmist. I think people who live in Washington and in Oregon and Northern California should be aware of these concerns, these dangers. People should be prepared in the sense of having emergency equipment nearby. Many people who live in the Northwest have had experience with Mount St. Helens, and they remember that, and they know what it's like. Even a small eruption like Mount St. Helens can cause significant disruption of daily life. In Hawaii, they have fewer of these big explosive volcanoes, but they do have lava flows that go out to the ocean. And in the recent years, we've had eruptions where the lava flows went through neighborhoods and destroyed whole neighborhoods. And so people have to be aware of that. You live in Hawaii, it's paradise, but you're living on a volcano that's active.
Nature can be unpredictable. Dr. Lees, thanks so much for sharing your insights, your expertise with NewsPoint 360 today. We really, really appreciate your time.
Well, it's been my pleasure.